Hi, today, back by popular demand, is my series going through the entire play of An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley. In the most recent video, we made it to Act 2, Part 1. This one is going to be Act 2, Part 2. There will, of course, be an Act 2, Part 3 before I start addressing the third act of the play. We're going to be looking at the individual lines here in which we discover exactly what it was Gerald did to Eva Smith and the consequences of his actions, and how the inspector makes him take at least some responsibility for what he has done. Now, the first thing that it's interesting to note is the point at which Burling asks, "What is the matter with that child?" This is entirely symbolic of how he and his wife treat Sheila throughout the play, or rather they have treated her throughout her young life. They infantilize her, and as such she is unable really to grasp some of the more complicated aspects of life. It explains why she's so childish at the beginning of the play, relying on the significance of the engagement ring to prove the value of it, rather than actually understanding marriage as a concept itself. It also shows why she's so reticent to accept what she knows to be true about what Gerald has really been doing, and also is why that she speaks to her parents in such a naive and immature way. So this is very much a representation of how Burling views both women and also his young daughter. Now, at this point, Sybil begins to speak, and she responds to the inspector, as the stage direction says, with sudden anger. Now, this is interesting because it implies how unused she is to being questioned or challenged on anything. She is a woman who considers herself to be above nearly everyone else in society, with the exception, of course, being upper-class men. And so therefore, when the inspector begins to take charge, she sees it as an affront. She sees it as impertinence, which is a word she uses again and again, especially because he is demonstrably from a lower social class than she is. And so she thinks that it is in some way out of order for him to speak to her like that. We now hear about how Eva Smith changed her name to Daisy Renton. Now, Daisy Renton is a name that is loaded with meaning. You can see more about all of the meanings of the characters' names in the video that I've made on the matter, on the topic. But here it's worth talking initially about the word Daisy. Now, Daisy connotes freshness and beauty, which is both integral aspects to Eva Smith's character, both her prettiness, which is something that is such an issue for so many of the characters, but also the idea that she wishes to leave behind the life that saw her sacked from Millward's and from Burling's works, and begin again, a rebirth, if you like. But of course, this contrasts with her last name, the name that she selects, Renton, because it hints at the way in which she is unfortunately forced to sell her body and to men, ultimately to Eric. She would have done it to Alderman Meggerty if Gerald hadn't been there, and to some extent, what she does to Gerald. Obviously not in quite the sense of the transaction that we see with Eric, but similar in some ways. And it implies how impossible it is for a woman like her to be able to have a fresh start, to have an escape from the unfortunate life of poverty and misery that she is in. It shows that she cannot have a second chance. What the Burlings and Gerald have done to her mean that it is impossible for her to start again. Gerald asks the inspector why exactly he was so certain that he knew Eva Smith or Daisy Renton. And in doing so shows that even now, when he has essentially been caught red-handed, if you like, that he is trying to avoid taking responsibility. He's trying to avoid the scandal of what he did coming out, which betrays his total inability to accept responsibility for his actions, which is something that we see later on in the play when he is one of the first to try and explain reasons for why the Burlings may not be guilty for what they've done. Now, as the inspector questions Gerald, he talks about how he met her at the Palace Bar in Brumley. Sheila sarcastically retorts, "We didn't think you meant Buckingham Palace," which is a usage of humour here that is key to understanding or to marking Sheila's character transformation. The sarcasm that she uses is a sharp juxtaposition with the kind of awestruck and naive way with which she views Gerald and speaks to him in the beginning of Act 1. In that section, she treats him as upper-class men would have expected to be treated by their young fiancés, with total respect and deference, not in any way questioning or challenging. Even the ring is something that she says, "Oh, is it what you wanted me to have?" implying that she hangs on his every word. And the fact that she's now starting to pick at his character flaws is indicative of how she is developing and evolving into a more mature and independent young woman. Gerald is forced to admit that the bar they were in was somewhere that women of the town would spend a lot of their time. This term is important and could be analysed from an AO2 point of view because it is, the correct terminology is euphemism. A euphemism is when a term is used that sounds slightly more respectable or slightly less sinister, is used in place of something that sounds very crass or very hard to hear. Now, it's a euphemism here, of course, for prostitute. Eva Smith has had to resort to prostitution, having no employment opportunities available to her. But it's indicative of the fact that the upper classes try to mask the seriousness of everything they do, that they refer to it as women of the town. They do not want to accept the harsh, cold realities of life, and so try to almost create a rose-tinted existence, which is something that they can use as a comfort blanket to pretend the world isn't as unpleasant as it really is. The word squiffy, of course, is a perfect reference point to this rather than drunk. Gerald goes on to describe the fact that he didn't really want to be there. Whether or not this is true remains to be seen. He comments that he hates the hard-eyed and dough-faced women that are usually there, instead preferring Eva Smith when he sees her because she's young and beautiful. Now, it's interesting that he makes this comment because the hard eyes of a person imply that they have seen a lot of suffering and that they have almost had, the joy of life beaten out of them. And also the fact that they are dough-faced might insinuate, firstly a lack of beauty, but also perhaps, again, a sort of worn-outness. And it's again interesting because it's exactly the fault of men like him that the women who he so rudely says are hard-eyed and dough-faced appear that way. It is people like men like his fault that they have become such beings, come to look in such a way, because actually he is the one with his behaviours and actions that creates the misery and suffering for them. But also it shows that there is a spark of humanity in him, which is obviously something Priestley wants us to accept, because it shows that actually it reminds him that he is in some way responsible. The thing about Gerald is that he is not a stupid man, and so being reminded of this responsibility is almost the thing that makes him want to stay away from them, which is in some ways worse because it shows that he knows what he's doing and accepts it, but buries it deep down. And this is what he's able to do when he sees the soft brown hair and big dark eyes of Eva Smith. Now, this is very similar to how The Farmer's Bride is described if you study the Love and Relationships poetry anthology with AQA. There is a sense of naivety, but there's also a sense that he views her almost as prey. He therefore is cast as the predator. The big dark eyes, indicative of youth, of innocence, of purity, of naivety, like a small animal caught in the headlights, which is precisely what she is, and it presents him as I said, exactly like a predator, someone higher up the food chain, which he literally is, if we take the food chain to be the social class hierarchy. And so therefore it's interesting from that point of view. He then sort of breaks down Gerald in the middle of a sentence, and then he comments how he's now only taking it in properly, which is Priestley's, as I said, weird attempt to humanise Gerald. Now, you can drill down into that if you want to criticise the writer. Priestley had some very questionable relationships with women himself, and so therefore perhaps sees some of himself in Gerald. But the fact is that he tries to humanize Gerald in this moment. And in doing so, what he really does is he makes Gerald seem almost completely callous because he is unable to see how this has affected anyone other than him. It's almost like he now feels guilt for it. Sheila, on the other hand, comments, "Between us, we killed her." Now, this shows that she is far further ahead in her moral rehabilitation than Gerald is, probably further ahead than he will ever get, because she is stating, in no uncertain terms, that they are the ones who have killed her, that this is not an accident, that this is not a sad, coincidence. This is actually something that they, the Burlings and Gerald, have contrived together to do. And it shows that rather than feeling sorry for herself, she is willing to say the hard things, say I did this, and then therefore move forwards with it. Again, showing her to be moving along her character arc. Now, when Gerald continues to describe the situation, he references Alderman Meggerty. And Sybil says, "Surely you don't mean Alderman Meggerty." And this is, again, a characteristic of Sybil's. Her inability to actually see the cold, hard reality of life around her. She is the one most desperate to excuse the flaws and the sins of the upper classes because it suits her to do so. She lives in a delusion whereby because somebody is wealthy, that automatically implies respectability. And anytime this is challenged, she acts with total shock. The thought that Eric could be anything other than a drunk, the thought that Alderman Meggerty would be a womanizer and a rogue and a sot, is something that shocks her because she doesn't believe that these sins are something that people like her are capable of. Whereas in reality, it's exactly these kinds of people that are capable of these sins, and often more so because they are in a position to abuse the power that they have in order to make these things happen the way they want them to. It shows Sybil to be a totally ignorant person, in some ways more ignorant than her husband, certainly to the realities of life in Brumley. And so therefore it makes her a completely unlikable character. In fact, even Gerald is willing to admit out loud that, as I said, he's a notorious womanizer. The fact that he's known for this trait, essentially, if we think about it in reality, being somebody who is guilty of sexual assault is what a notorious womanizer in this context really means. Again, even slightly euphemistic language there. It reminds the audience of this lesson that the wealthy are capable of doing such things. And it reminds the audience that every time Sybil refuses to believe something bad about either her own family or about the people that she associates with in her social circles, it's unlikely to be that she is correct. And in total irony, she continues, "We are learning something tonight." And irony is the language device being used here, because clearly what she does later on in the play is proof that she has learnt absolutely nothing. The things that she and her husband and Gerald go on to do and say, the ways in which they totally try to sweep everything under the carpet, imply that they have learnt not a single thing of the inspector's message of socialism or collective responsibility. Now, the inspector raises an interesting line of inquiry when he asks Gerald if she drank, to which Gerald replies no, possibly because she was too hungry, possibly because she didn't want to put herself in a situation where she wasn't totally in control. We can only speculate. But either way, the difference between the classes is emphasised and represented through the consumption of alcohol. We've talked already about how the Burlings drink alcohol very liberally. And for them, it represents a kind of safety net, an escape, something that they can retreat behind when they don't wish to accept the realities of the things they've done. And also something that they can use to convince themselves they're respectable. Again, look at how Eric is squiffy, but the person that Sybil then later blames as a drunken young idler. It implies, though, that Eva is better than that. That Eva doesn't have the power or the luxury of being able to let her guard down in that way, and she doesn't have the money to do so. And also, it further delineates her as being totally opposite to the Burlings. Now, something that is worth picking up on here that is, I I think a really good and interesting point to make about Gerald's character is he describes what he and Eva Smith spoke about. And he mentions the shop millwards, and also she mentions the strike at Burling's Works. Now, as we mentioned, Gerald is the one who in Act 3 returns and manages to persuade Arthur and Sheila at the Arthur and Sybil, that they could easily have been discussing different girls, that there is no evidence of the fact that they are all talking about actions they did to the same person. And so therefore, how could it have led to a death? This comment here indicates that actually Daisy Renton was the same person that Arthur Burling sacked, and Sybil Burling and Sheila Burling had fired from Millwards, because this is something that she admits to happening to him. And because of this, it presents him at the end of the play as being an utter liar for trying to make them all retreat into the delusion that they may have not actually been all acting against the same girl. And so it's important to note that, the slipperiness of Gerald. He describes bringing her to the apartment he was keeping for his friend, and then comments that he didn't ask for anything in return. And here he is managing to trick himself into thinking that he acted in good faith, he acted as though he were an honest hero, and that there was no way in which what he was doing could possibly lead to a sexual liaison, an affair, because he thinks, well, I was just doing the right thing. And it seems to a big part of Gerald is his ability to delude himself. Arthur is ignorant in the sense that he refuses to educate himself. Sybil is deluded in the sense that she is willfully misbelieving or that people like her could do things incorrectly. Gerald's delusion is about himself and about his own motivations for actions. He has managed to trick himself into thinking that he was acting honourably towards Eva Smith without realising the total power imbalance that existed between them naturally. He then comments that her becoming his mistress was inevitable, which is a word that really summarises his misogyny, I would suggest. The fact that he sees no possible friendship between them, and that his assumption that the relationship must become sexual is something that shows him to be, truly someone who hates women. He cannot conceive of, having a relationship with Eva Smith on a personal level. And that, again, implies the misogyny of the class system, because it's not just because she is beautiful that he expects that they will become romantically linked. It's also because she is poor and therefore, in his eyes, a commodity to be used and to satisfy his desires. Now, Burling, it's just worth commenting here that Burling begins to defend himself again. He says he did what any employer might have done, and so he's hiding behind cold hard capitalism as a justification for why he sacked Eva Smith. And in some ways, he is not wrong. It's hard to discern anything personal what he did to her necessarily, and so therefore he tries to almost excuse himself again. And when confronted with whether or not they loved one another, Gerald says it's hard to say, which is clearly an evasion. It's not that hard a thing to say, and what this suggests is that he didn't love her. But also it reminds us that for him, loving her would have been fundamentally impossible, because they are not of the same social class. And it shows the irresponsibility of the affair that he struck up with her, because he would have known very clearly from the beginning that he could never be possible of loving her, because he could never find it possible to be married to her, because his social class wouldn't allow it. He is at least honest enough to comment that nearly any man would have enjoyed exactly what he did about the situation, being looked up to, of course, the sexual gratification of being with a beautiful woman. And so therefore, at least he's honest about the pervading misogyny in the patriarchal Edwardian society. It's something that if Eric had perhaps been a little less of an alcoholic or a little less blunt, could have happened between him and Eva Smith also. And in doing so, that is something that really tarnishes the whole establishment and the whole class structure that existed. Now, Gerald then retreats into comments about how he wishes he could have. Wishes he could have in some way been punished already because then he'd feel better, which is an interesting comment because it shows that actually the thing that is upsetting him most about this is not the fact that Eva Smith is dead, it's the fact that he feels bad about it. And it shows again his total inability to accept guilt. Or rather, he views feeling guilty. He does feel guilt, which is perhaps, in his favour, but it is something that is happening to him that he wishes could go away because it's making him feel bad. He has no empathy here whatsoever for the idea that Eva Smith is the one who has suffered. Gerald reminds us that he was paying Eva Smith an allowance, and of course the language of what I allowed her is very evocative of the power dynamic in their relationship, the fact that he had it all and that she had absolutely none. And is worth noting that fact when considering, any thoughts of sympathy towards him or any thoughts that he may have been trying to treat her as well as he could have done. And the scene ends, or rather this aspect of the scene ends, with Sheila returning the ring, which is a potent symbol. It's something that a lot of you will write about. And the symbolism of returning the ring is obvious because it is something that emphasizes the fact that Sheila has changed who she is. She has become a woman with agency. She is no longer a girl. She is becoming a young woman who recognizes the fact that what her fiancé has done is appalling. And also it's showing that she does not wish to get married to him anymore, certainly under these circumstances. She comments that we would have to start again, which is indicative of the fact that she sees Gerald in a new light, and she also perceives herself as a completely new woman. Which is important for her because where before she was subservient, she is now the one who is willing to be an equal partner, something we suspect that Gerald wouldn't particularly want in his wife given everything about him. And so therefore it's almost like a full circle character arc with him giving her the ring and the manner in which he does at the start and how she responds to it with the, isn't it a beauty, now I really feel engaged. It shows that she has developed the critical evaluative skills to, understand morality well. She has learnt this message from the inspector. It's far too simplistic to say that at this point Sheila has become a socialist, but it's certainly important to note that she has begun to take on his message of social responsibility. Now, Burling, of course, beginning to see his carefully brokered business deal in tatters, tries to intervene. He says, you must understand that a lot of young men. Now, in doing so, he is trying to behave this in doing so, he is trying to excuse this misogynist behaviour. He is trying to make it seem like behaving in this manner, incriminating himself in a way. At the beginning, when Sybil makes a comment about having to understand that men become busy at works, Burling makes comment about occasionally, having a bit of fun as a younger man. It shows maybe that in this way it can be viewed as representative of all young men. I mean, Gerald isn't a young man per se in the way Eric is, but he's young enough and handsome enough to be having as many liaisons with women as he wants to have, particularly because of his wealth, and therefore this reminds us that it isn't actually a matter of looks, it's more a matter of social status and power. I hope you found this video helpful. Please make sure you stay subscribed, make sure you like the video, and look out for more videos that are about an Inspector Calls. Thank you. Goodbye.